Gay pirates have pretty much become a trope at this point. Homosexual relationships often play a minor or even major part in pirate media. Jack Sparrow is often seen as exhibiting stereotypical homosexual behavior. Our Flag Means Death is a romantic comedy about two homosexual pirates. And most interesting is perhaps Black Sails, which is really about a naval officer scorned from English society for his sexual preferences and seeking revenge for it. And no doubt you've heard the phrase, butt pirate. This portrayal is quite recent, and stands in stark contrast to the traditional presentation of the pirate as a hypermasculine womanizer. It all dates back to the book Sodomy and the Pirate Tradition, written in 1984 by Barry Richard Burg. It seeks to answer the rhetorical question posed in the title of this video, and whilst you might expect to be provided some sort of simple answer, this is simply not possible. Burg even admits this in his book, saying there's not enough documentation from pirate society to do anything but theorize. So instead, this video will more so provide an insight into this period, so radically different from our own, and perhaps provide a better understanding of how they might have viewed this very contemporary topic. And I say contemporary because discussions about homosexuality and homosexuality in history is not only popular nowadays, but a rather recent phenomenon. Partly because discussion about homosexuality has been socially taboo for the past 1 or 2 centuries, and partly because our modern conception of homosexuality is rather recent, as is the idea of any sexual identity. It's easy to think that all people in history had a certain view of this or any other topic, but history should never be seen as a continuum. When people think about sex in history, they think about the restrictive morality of the Victorian era, which is simply not applicable for the 17th and 18th centuries. In the Victorian era, the existence of the female orgasm was denied, whereas in the 17th century it was widely believed to be necessary for impregnation. And these perspectives are reflective of the sexual beliefs of either period. The 17th century is so interesting because it is in many ways strangely similar to our own, more so than any other period in history, even the 19th and 20th centuries, but also because, at the same time, it's so radically alien. Peter Laslett wrote a book describing the structures and culture of this period, and calling it The World We Have Lost. In many ways, we simply cannot grasp the mindset of 17th century people. History is fickle. It is a shattered window whose shards we only possess a few of, allowing us a mere glimpse instead of a full view, infinitely more complex. People back then communicated meanings and ideas which we do not have access through in technology or the limited remnants of writing, where ideas which were apparent to the people back then instead prove arcane to us, or inherent of some other meaning. Thus, one should be cautious about using the past to legitimize their own ideas. Allow me to speak directly. The ongoing right-wing versus left-wing debates on sexuality, gender, etc. During the 17th century, it was common to draw biblical or historical parallels to legitimize the actions of your nation, the existence of your royal family or monarchy, or even your sexual actions. Nowadays we do the same. There are people who look at this period, at pirates, and use it to justify their perspectives on the aforementioned socio-political topics today. No one can stop you from doing so, but it's a very soft foundation to base your philosophies on, since a new example might suddenly appear and prove you entirely wrong. In the end, I think history is best used to gain an insight into the human condition and how infinitely malleable we are as a species. I discussed previously on how recent our ideas of homosexuality and sexual identity are. Neither do we have a solid understanding of it today, especially what causes it. There is the constant debate on nature versus nurture. This also makes it hard to estimate the amount of homosexuals in history. The amount could have been lower, higher, or fluctuated between different time periods and places for various social and natural reasons. Nowadays it is estimated that between 5% to 10% of any population is homosexual. In a study conducted by Michael Rook in 1996, it was shown that in late 15th century Florence, 2/3 of all men were accused of sodomy. Most of them were submissive partners from between the ages of 14 to 23, becoming dominant partners in their mid-20s. But these adult men would also visit female prostitutes and eventually had wives and children. Europeans in the 18th century observed homosexual tendencies in China, Japan, India, and Turkey, whilst in Europe, homosexuality appears to have been on the decline, judging by records of convictions of sexual crimes. One of the biggest mistakes in researching historical homosexuality is one I've already fallen to in this video, largely out of convenience, that is using modern terminology to explain historical phenomena. Homosexuality was not defined until the mid-19th century, and until the 1930s, the Western legal system understood it not as an identity, but as an action: sodomy. Sodomy and buggery were two loosely defined terms, including a bunch of sexual crimes, further complicating any modern analysis. Thus, before getting into the thick, juicy meat of the video, it is necessary to understand the meaning of sodomy. Afterwards, we can delve into the perspectives on sodomy in the 17th century. Pirate society was temporary and parasitical. It was a replica of existing societies in the colonial, maritime, and old world. Therefore, we need to look at sodomy in those societies before we can finally get some semblance of an answer to the question if pirates were gay. So grab your dildo cup of rum, put on your leather BDSM outfit, and hoist the Rainbow Roger, you salty seaman. As mentioned previously, homosexuality as we know it did not exist as an identity in the 17th century. If a modern man identifying as a homosexual would go back in time and commit homosexual acts, he'd be called a bugger or a sodomite, not because of any identity, but because he had committed the sins of buggery or sodomy. He could then potentially be absolved of these sins. It wouldn't be seen as a core part of who he was as a person. The fact that I'm using two words, sodomy and buggery, to describe the same thing is no doubt confusing, and it was during the period itself. Buggery is a synonym for sodomy, but they could assume different meanings. From the perspective of the Christian theologians who first defined it, it was quite clear-cut. Sodomy meant any penetrative sex, not intended for reproductive purposes. Most commonly, this included masturbation, pederasty, pedophilia, bestiality, male-on-male sex, and even heterosexual oral and anal penetration. And because it was functionally an umbrella term, I need to stress that this is primarily what the video will discuss: sodomy as a whole, and not necessarily our modern understanding of homosexuality, though with a focus on male-on-male relationships. Confused? Welcome to history. As we will see in various examples throughout the video, it is hard to truly identify cases of historical individuals as specifically homosexual. Oftentimes we have no record of their sexual acts at all. They might simply be speaking fondly of a male friend, but whether it is in a platonic or non-platonic fashion is entirely up to speculation and often personal biases. When we do have explicit records of their sexual activity, these men often engage in other activities we'd call bisexual, pedophilic, or zoophilic. Of course, at some points I will be anachronistic and use the term homosexual in reference to male-on-male sexual interaction, simply to differentiate it from other kinds of sodomy. In the 5th century, St. Augustine made it very clear that sodomy was first and foremost a sin against God. And this would remain the stance of the Church throughout history, and during the Middle Ages, sodomy was subject to ecclesiastical censure. It was not until the 16th century and the struggle between church and state that buggery and sodomy would become a civil crime, part of legal codes. The religious gravity of sodomy can be understood through its etymological meaning. It derives from the biblical tale of Sodom and Gomorrah, in which God destroyed two cities with fire and brimstone because the male inhabitants had unnatural intercourse with each other. During the Middle Ages and early modern period, sodomy was often considered so serious as to not be directly named, referred to instead as things like the silent sin, the most grievous act. It was common to accuse political, national, and religious enemies of sodomy, because then you basically invoke the same divine punishment upon them that God bestowed Sodom and Gomorrah. Buggery is basically a Franco-English synonym for sodomy. It stems from the French bougre, referring to heretics. Heresy and sodomy were seen as closely intertwined by the Church. It seems related to the Latin bulgarus, referring to Bulgarians, specifically to the heretical branch of Orthodox Christianity present in Bulgaria, called bogomilism. During the 16th century, bugger and bougre was a general word for sexual deviance, but for most of the time referred to men romantically involved with other men. In the 18th century, the English would retain the meaning of this word, but bougre in French would become a general term for a scoundrel. Throughout the early modern period, it was a very common insult and swear word. Scotsman Donald MacBain noted at several points in the early 18th century how Frenchmen called him a English bouger, indicating that it was an insult closely associated with the English nation, perhaps also indicative of some of their tendencies. Pirate perspective on sodomy would have been shaped on the perspectives of their home countries. Most often, these would have been England, France, and the Netherlands. Whilst we will take a look at the perspectives on sodomy in these nations, it is first necessary to give a brief overview of where they got their perceptions from, in part at least. Because whilst each of these mentioned societies inherited their ideas from somewhere, they also put their own little twist on it. Anyway, the Northern European societies inherited their views of sodomy from the Christian tradition and the Germanic pagan one. The Abrahamitic hostility towards sodomy stems from the ancient Hebrews, as made most significant by the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is often given as an example of how all Western society has viewed non-heterosexual behavior throughout all history, which isn't necessarily the case. St. Aquinas very much defined the antagonistic attitude in the 5th century, and during the Middle Ages, the Church wrote of condemning sodomites to horrific punishments, like being burned at the stake or otherwise tortured, even that mentions of their crimes should be erased. But almost paradoxically, sodomy was first and foremost seen as a sin against the divine order, more so than a crime, meaning that it could be forgiven. Thus, sodomites were often allowed to repent or even given a pass depending on the severity of the sodomy in question. Two men engaged in consensual sodomy wasn't as grievous as sodomizing a child, a dog, or denying the existence of God. But sodomy was often seen as a root of heretical thought. Neither might consensual sex between two men be seen as more serious than a woman prostituting herself, performing fellatio on several men, and fathering bastard children. Ancient Germanic society is a bit harder to analyze, since they left behind few of their own writings, few of which discuss the topic. Thus, we often have to rely on outside or later sources, which may be affected by ulterior motives. For example, there's Germania, written by Tacitus in the 1st century AD. He describes how the Germanic tribes punished promiscuity, prostitution, and sexual deviancy. The following is written: "Traitors and deserters they hang upon trees. Cowards and sluggards and unnatural prostitutes they smother in mud and bogs under a heap of hurdles. Such diversity in the executions has this view, that in punishing of glaring iniquities, it behooves likewise to display them to sight, but effeminacy and pollution must be buried and concealed." Unnatural prostitutes and effeminacy can all be interpreted as homosexual, but Tacitus's Germania has often been viewed as a partly allegorical condemnation of Roman society, and may not reflect the entirety of Germanic society from the Stone Age up until and after Christianity. The one Germanic law with a provision against homosexual behavior is the Old Norwegian Gulatingslov, stating the following: "And if two men enjoy the pleasures of the flesh and are accused and convicted of it, they shall both suffer permanent outlawry." This law was instituted in 1164, when Norway had been Christianized, but historians view it as indicative of the ancient Germanic perspective on homosexual behavior. Anti-homosexual sentiment is likewise present in the sagas, which often have pre-Christian origins, but many of them are Christian, and all of them were written down by Christian monks. The medieval Christian view on sodomy did not really change with the Protestant Reformation. Both Catholics and Protestants were keen on accusing the other denomination of sodomy. The Pope and his associates were frequently accused of sodomizing one another, and the choir boys, of course. And a Catholic author wrote a fake biography on John Calvin, in which he was portrayed as a sodomite. In England, the dispute between church and state and control over the legal system eventually led buggery to be criminalized under civil law in 1533, but this wasn't due to any moral outrage or concern over sexual practices, simply a legal matter. Most of the sources I was able to acquire regarding the 17th century stance on sexuality comes from England, so this is where the focus of the video will lie. But from what I could discern, the 17th century English perspective wasn't radically different from anywhere else. But opinions and ideas diverged slightly between nations, and since I was able to find material regarding the attitudes towards sodomy in France, the Netherlands and colonial Spain, they will be discussed to a certain degree. According to the law, sodomy was punishable by death, but this wasn't always reflective of societal attitudes, and it was ultimately up to the court to decide an appropriate sentence. It was common for criminals in the 17th century to be sentenced to death but pardoned, or given a lighter sentence than what they could legally be prescribed. This often appears to have been the case for sodomy, where it was uncommon for someone to get executed simply for engaging in consensual male-on-male sodomy. Sodomy was most often punished by the lash, fines, or placement in the pillory. Those who stood in the pillory were most often sentenced for attempted sodomy rather than having committed it, something which was hard to produce witnesses for. Newspaper accounts contain more notices of arrests for sodomy rather than convictions, indicating a limited enthusiasm for bringing those cases to actual trial. The lack of prosecutions and reduced charges indicates a lack of anti-sodomite zealotry in 17th century England. If someone was prosecuted for sodomy, it was usually because it accompanied a slew of sexual crimes disturbing to society or actively harmful to other individuals. One minister had engaged in homosexual buggery 18 times. His other sins included attempted bestiality, drunkenness, baptizing an illegitimate child, defending imagery in churches, asserting sins committed after baptism were imitations rather than corruption, and calling Christ a bastard. Sodomy was not an identity, it was but one out of several religious sins. One case of an extreme degenerate was Mervyn Touchet, the Earl of Audley. Aside from being charged with sodomy, he was likewise accused of ordering his servants to rape his wife, sodomizing his servants, commanding and countenancing the debauchery of his daughter, prostituting her, voyeurism, child molestation, and buggering the servants who raped the countess. Worst of all, he was a Catholic. The attitude towards sodomy becomes apparent in the different accounts of Touchet's trial. The 1699 edition was prefaced by a denunciation of not only rape, pederasty and sodomy, but also of lower-class men attempting to seduce women of high standing, and blaspheming. Another example is George Dodeny. He was accused of raping a man, attempting to seduce several men, engaged in pederasty, masturbation, exhibitionism, and was finally brought to justice after trying to rape a mare. Revulsion was only shown towards his act of bestiality, which was viewed as especially horrific during this period. Humans engaging in sex with animals essentially meant they forsook their humanity. It was commonly believed that humans could procreate with animals, as evidenced by several bizarre cases from the colonies. One man was executed after having been accused of buggering a sow, since she had given birth to a deformed fetus, quote, a prodigious monster, which some people claimed bore a semblance to the man in question. They were simply trying to stop the spread of the pig people. Both the perpetrator and the animal were typically executed. Take, for example, Thomas Granger, executed in 1642, along with a mare, cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 cows, and turkey, which he had buggered. This was done in accordance to Leviticus. And in a lot of cases, those accused of sodomy might escape sentencing owing to their wealth or status in society. Lionel Gatford lamented that a cleric accused of sodomy was only made to publicly repent, whilst ministers critiquing the men in power were forced out of their livings. For the most part, people were ambivalent towards sodomites. It was simply seen as one of many sexual sins, and one of many sins in general which you might engage in. Extramarital sex, cursing, blaspheming, alcoholism. And a lot of people in the 17th century did not even consider consensual sex to be a sin, and regarded it as outside of any moral framework. Of course, sodomy was still viewed as deviant behavior, but usually mocked rather than aggressively reviled or actively hunted. As long as you kept it between consensual adults and behind at least somewhat closed doors, it was usually fine. The attitudes towards sexual sins and sodomy is best explained by a sort of tier list, ranking the various sins based on their severity, going from acceptable to unacceptable. At the top we have vaginal intercourse within a married couple. You would have no complaints about it, and it was even encouraged by the Puritans. Next we have oral or anal sex within a married couple. This classified as sodomy, so it was a sin and technically illegal. And though especially religious people might complain about it, it would never form a strong enough case to indict someone. Then there's extramarital vaginal intercourse. Most people did not care, but it was technically illegal and some people were arrested for prostitution. It was especially severe under Puritan control, where people could even be indicted and punished for public kissing. Next we'd have extramarital sodomy, pretty much seen as bad. Masturbation, worse than extramarital sex, especially to the more religious folk. But again, most people did not care. Both male and female masturbation was incredibly common in this period, with some writing treatises prescribing it as healthy. Others tried to push it as unwholesome and use it to sell quack medicine. However, most common was mutual masturbation. Most extramarital sex between men and women in this period consisted of intense cuddling, kissing, and mutual masturbation, not actual penetration. Masturbation did only really become a problem if you started doing it publicly, and it was often associated with heretical thought. Then we have consensual sex between adult men. Very low on the list, but not too lower than extramarital heterosexual sex or masturbation, primarily viewed as deviant. Pederasty is kinda hard to place, and something which has been discussed and debated upon. There is the aforementioned study conducted in 15th century Florence. In the 1530s, the agents of Henry VIII investigated the lives of monks, discovering that most of them masturbated and had relations with women and boys. This has led some historians to speculate that the number was much higher among laymen. It has been argued that in the 17th century, they believed grown men to be attracted to passivity, a trait inhibited by young boys and females. It was when the boy grew into a man and out of his passivity that it would be viewed as unacceptable and deviant, at least by the wider public, as it were. But some people in the period would strangely enough use religion to justify pederasty and buggery, comparing it to Jesus' relation with John. So on the scale of 17th century sexual taboos, pederasty could be placed potentially higher or lower than sodomy between consenting male adults. Finally, there's the level of unacceptable sex crimes, sodomizing minors, animals, or rape. A perpetrator of any of these crimes would be executed. Even though this video concerns the male-dominated pirate society, a brief note on lesbians might be desired. No one really cared about them as long as they did not engage in blasphemous behavior. It also appears as though they had strap-ons. There's really nothing new under the sun. Having looked at the overall religious and legal perspectives on sodomy, next we'll look at how it was viewed across the stratas of society and present in contemporary media. Firstly, it's best to briefly discuss it based on religious denomination. Though it didn't seem to vary too much, the different denominations of Christianity seem to have had slightly different views on sodomy and sex crimes. Anglicans appear to have been the most relaxed. Catholics came next. Puritans were quite strict. They wouldn't really care if you were homosexual, but keep it in private. Calvinists seem to have been the most strict, and sentences against male sodomites were incredibly common and severe in the Netherlands, as will later be discussed. James I of England is perfect for setting the stage for a societal discussion of sodomy. Historians strongly believe him to have engaged in sodomy with other men. He explained his relation to the Duke of Buckingham as, Christ had his John, so he, James, had his George. A French poet wrote the following: "It is well known that the King of England fucks the Duke of Buckingham." Of course, men in the 17th century were more affectionate towards each other. It was socially acceptable to kiss, share a bed, and speak very affectionately, but still keeping it on a platonic level. So it's often hard to discern during this period when relations might have been homosexual, and it seems to have been during the period itself. At the end of the century, William III denied that his friendship with the younger Earl of Albemarle was criminal. It should also be mentioned that James I also had extramarital relations with women and several children with his wife. The attitudes towards sodomites and all sexual trends of the 17th century can correctly be observed through the theatre. In Restoration-era dramas, homosexuality was not portrayed as an acceptable form of sexual expression, being instead used as satirical condemnation, and could get incredibly vulgar. In one such play, printed in 1684, titled Sodom, or the quintessence of debauchery. The king of Sodom discovers that buggery with boys and men is far more pleasurable than activity with women. He decreed all males to commit anal sex, and even appoints a bugger master general. Eventually a royal physician declares this to be a source of corruption and disease, but the king rejects it, leading to God destroying a city with heavenly fire. Sodomites even appear in Charles Johnson's The Successful Pirate, an important play in the history of pirates and based on the myths of Henry Every. Though published in 1713, the early 18th century was in all regards a continuation of the 17th. In this play, two men abandon their wives to live together on Madagascar before realizing they want no part of one another and happily return to their wives. This play might also be reflective of how some people may have viewed the far-flung travels and piracy as a potential refuge for such relations. Accusations of sodomy was a common political tool. Between 1678 and 1681, England was gripped by anti-Catholic hysteria, culminating in a fictitious conspiracy called the Popish Plot. The alleged perpetrators of this plot were, amongst many crimes, accused of sodomy. When William III usurped the throne of England at the behest of Parliament, his opponents, the Jacobites, frequently accused him of being a sodomite as well. The lower classes had no connections with court politics, were not influenced by continental manners, or had ever heard of the popular plays or poetries. But it doesn't seem as if their views on sodomy were especially different. Samuel Pepys, who came from the lower middle class, didn't seem more repulsed by sodomy than by other sexual sins. John Evelyn, a priest and staunchly religious, referred to buggery as a vice which need not be named, but believed that perpetrators could repent for committing it. It wasn't something you had to be killed over. The lower classes seem to have regarded sodomy as a sexual deviancy, not worthy to be particularly upset over, but definitely worth laughing at. The humor of this period was incredibly crude, as indicated by the widely available broadside ballads and pamphlets. People laughed at rape and rapists, pedophiles, lechery and wife battery. In a short anti-clerical manifesto titled "A Full and True Account of a Dreadful Fire That Lately Broke Out in the Pope's Breeches," the Pope suddenly falls in love with an English woman. As they are about to do it, the Pope is close to, quote, pitch too low his key, as he was rarely used to opening the foregate. After the woman departs, the Pope catches a venereal disease and is cured of it. The story ends with, as soon as the Pope grew well, he cursed port by book and bell, and vowed to keep, in spite of horse, his key for 2 unlock back doors. The lower classes may have acted aggressively towards sentenced sodomites, especially in the 18th century. In 1719, when William Holdbrook was pilloried at Bloomsbury Market, it was reported that the mob had certainly murdered him could they have got him in their power, for a hackney coach was torn to pieces that took him up to carry him to Newgate. This may not necessarily have been indicative of a general sentiment towards sodomites, however, since the mob of London was prone to violence and anger during public holidays, anniversaries and grievances. They would frequently get excited during public executions and require trained bands to keep in check. Of course, during the 18th century, our modern conception of homosexuality would start to develop. While it previously had been believed that all men lusted for young boys and women, it was now starting to be believed that most men lusted for women, but some only desired men. This also coincided with a changing perspective on heterosexual intercourse, with a bigger emphasis on penetration instead of mutual masturbation and cuddling. In the 1720s, the Society for the Reformation of Manners made a public outcry against the decently sized subculture of sodomites present in London. They called themselves Mollies. Ned Ward wrote the following: "There are a particular gang of sodomitical wretches in town who call themselves Mollies, and are so far degenerated from all masculine deportment, that they rather fancy themselves as women, imitating all the little vanities of the female sex, not omitting the indecencies of lewd women, to commit these odious bestialities that ought forever to be without a name." The Mollies had cropped up in the late 17th century as a distinct homosexual subculture, practicing effeminacy, transvestism, enactment of childbirth, and marriage rituals. Basing themselves out of several clubs called Molly Houses, they operated as prostitutes marketed to the upper class. It was a phenomenon entirely separate from the lower class and seafarers. They would create several scandals and spark general outrage, which contributed to the growing hostility towards homosexuals in the 18th century. Homosexuals would become seen as a social danger, whereas in the 17th century they had more so been seen as unfortunate, comical sinners. Mollies are the closest we have to transsexuals in this period. Earl Edward Hyde was accused by his political enemies as being a cross-dresser and morally bankrupt. This is allegedly a portrait of him dressed as a woman, but the veracity of these statements are uncertain. In the Netherlands, accusations of sodomy were a common political tool since the Middle Ages. During their lengthy war of independence against Spain, they would invariably accuse the Pope, Catholic clergy, and Spanish soldiers of engaging in buggery. The Low Countries appear to have been especially hostile towards homosexuals, with sentences against sodomites being more common than in England. This does not indicate that there were more sodomites in the Netherlands, but rather that they were more willing to take it to court and sentence them. There is also this rather notorious instance of a Dutch sailor being sentenced for sodomy and marooned on a desolate island. His journal was later discovered and published in England. Whereas England and the Netherlands would adopt an increasingly antagonistic perspective towards sodomy in the 18th century, France would drift in the opposite direction. Most of the prosecutions in early 18th century France appears to have been against members of the clergy engaging in pederasty. The last known execution for sodomy in France occurred in 1750. After the French Revolution in 1791, sodomy was decriminalized as a result of the French Penal Code, not due to some radical acceptance of homosexuality, but rather in a shift of political philosophy, which interfered less with people's personal affairs. The first American colonies were built by the Spanish and formed a prominent backdrop to the entire pirate age. These possessions were strictly controlled by an organized church, whose prominent representative was the Holy Inquisition. They were the ones responsible for managing cases of sodomy. However, sodomy itself was not technically heretical and would only lead to prosecution if some overt heresy was involved. In 1621, for example, a 20-year-old Mexican girl begged forgiveness for the crime of polución, masturbation, which she had been doing almost daily since the age of 11. The priests weren't nearly as bothered by this as by her fantasies of getting sexual visits from Christ and the Virgin Mary. Even then, unorthodox sexual desires were often understood as medical issues. In 1700, a Spaniard in Mexico was interned at a hospital after committing sodomy with a priest, and wishing to do so with the images of Christ. The priest who interrogated him basically said that the excessive heat had thrown his humus out of balance and made him impulsive like a beast. People in this period believed in humorism, the idea that the body was governed by 4 distinct substances, which had to be kept in balance. I've seen some people drawing connections between humorism and non-binary gender theory. Certain humors were more associated with men or women, and in some visual depictions of the humus, the body is often divided between the male and female sexes. At other points, the humus are compared to different ages, elements or personalities, different types of men. And these are all just allegorical explanations of what they regarded as a science. So I think the gender theory perspective is reading too much into it. Throughout the entire colonial period, sodomy in the Spanish colonies was tacitly tolerated as long as it did not involve other more overt heresies, and was kept behind closed doors. In several places like Mexico, there appears to have been a network or subculture of homosexuals largely living without fear, in spite of repression. Those who were caught were usually from the lower castes, economical and especially racial, whereas the aristocracy could use their wealth and status to dodge an execution, even if they were seen publicly engaging in pecados contra natura. Sexual sinning was far from repressed in 17th century England. That was until the Puritans came to power in 1649 and decided to restrict what they regarded as moral transgressions. Attempts were undertaken to eliminate gambling, cockfighting, drunkenness, whoring, and sodomy. The Puritans would not retain power in England, and for the rest of the century their moralizing was made fun of in the public sphere. Things were different in the northern colonies of New England, governed by Puritans who sought to establish a new godly paradise on earth. New England was a frequent staging point for pirates, many of whom were Puritans themselves, like the buccaneer Richard Sawkins. Puritans employed strict regulations against sexuality. Prostitution, adultery, and even public kissing were punishable by the lash, the pillory, or being branded with a hot iron. Most of the prosecutions regarded heterosexual crimes, partly because they were more heterosexuals than homosexuals, but also because they usually resulted in hard evidence in the form of pregnancies. Sodomy was easier to conceal. Sodomy could legally be punished by execution, and sometimes it was. In the mid-1620s, Virginia executed Richard Cornish for sodomy, but it seems to partly have been an excuse to get rid of a troublesome individual. In 1642 in Plymouth, Edward Mitchell was found guilty of lewd and sodomitical practices with Edward Preston. Mitchell had also been discovered to have been fooling around with Lydia Hatch, who had been caught in bed with her brother. All of the defenders were whipped, and Lydia was banished to Salem. This incident not only shows that sodomy was most often lightly punished, and usually not harsher than heterosexual crimes. Very often it was an economical necessity. The colonies often had a shortage of men, necessary as a labor and military force. Other times, the Puritans were entirely ambivalent towards sodomites. This becomes apparent from the trial of one Nicholas Senshen, charged with sodomizing one Nathaniel Pond in 1677. Testimonies reveal that Senshen's preferences were known in the town of Windsor for several years, but a complaint wasn't raised to the court until someone wanted to put him in political trouble. Senshen was convicted and simply made to put up his estate as bond for good behavior. Things were a bit different in the Dutch colonies, even though Dutch Calvinism had many similarities with Puritanism. The city of New Amsterdam was ripe with sexual immodesty, and Dutch women were widely regarded as lewd. Single and married women alike engaged in public kissing, lewd talk, and extramarital sex, sometimes with multiple men. The native women were regarded as worse, with one official calling them utterly unchaste and shamefully promiscuous. Certain governors with stricter convictions made attempts to crack down on the immoral excesses of the colony, and punishments against sodomy appear to have been especially harsh. In 1660, a soldier convicted of a crime condemned by God as an abomination was drowned in the river. In 1646, a black man convicted of sodomy was choked to death. The 10-year-old boy whom he had sodomized was tied to a stake and flogged. In other nations, it was exceedingly rare for young victims to be punished in such a manner. Of course, during the period, they were not always regarded as victims. The Caribbean colonies, founded by France and England, were initially founded as short-term commercial enterprises, established to produce large amounts of wealth in a short period of time. Long-term settlement was not considered. Coupled with a hot climate, tropical disease, and appalling death rate, the islands were only appealing to a small minority looking to make their fortunes, an overwhelming majority of which were men. The ambition was to make a fortune from plantation work or piracy, and then retire in the more pleasant home country as a well-off gentleman. B.R. Burg raised the theory that this male-dominated frontier society would have been regarded as an appealing refuge for homosexuals, and even that they constituted a significant part of the early colonial population in the Caribbean, especially between around 1620 and 1660. Logically it makes sense, but there is little documented evidence to prove its veracity. There is one document claiming how some of the male islanders were exceedingly friendly towards each other, another which seems openly misandric, and one letter from a colonial female referring to her neighbors as sodomites. Even though it most often meant homosexuals, sort of in our sense of the word, it could have broader implications. Arguments have also been made against the theories of Burg, some even raised by himself. One of the issues seems to be that he regards sexual drive as a short-term driving factor in history, whereas it primarily appears to have been money and just putting food on your plate. Sex was a nice thing, but could come later. Service in the colonies was not permanent. You could worry about getting a wife when you were rich and back home. Colonists who were extremely horny could likewise engage with native or slave women, the former of whom tended to be incredibly receptive towards European visitors, the latter evidenced by the rapidly growing mulatto population. The women imported early on were typically the wives of wealthy planters, indentured servants, or prostitutes. They formed a small minority, ranging from between as low as 10 to 30% of a colonial population. But as seen in the Dutch colonies and elsewhere, women were often shared between multiple men. You couldn't be picky, I guess. Even then, a lot of colonial men would have been without sex. Whilst the plantationer could have a harem of black queens, and an overseer might make an indentured woman his mistress, it was far more limited for the usually indentured masses. But it's not like they really had a choice. Surely some of them did turn to sodomy in various forms, like individual or group masturbation, or even active penetration, likely to a larger degree than in the home countries. There isn't enough documentation to provide solid evidence. One of the most glaring arguments could be Port Royal, Jamaica, the most prominent non-Spanish city in the Caribbean during the mid to late 17th century and a capital of pirates, being called the Sodom of the New World. It could refer to the city housing a lot of sodomites, as in homosexuals, but it could also have simply referred to sinners in general, not even sexual ones. Sodom was often invoked arbitrarily in the period. A Dutch professor from Utrecht complained that his students smoking tobacco resembled the flames of Sodom and Gomorrah. Willem Sluyter compared public drunks with the inhabitants of Sodom, who did not hide their sins either. Punishments against sodomy were even more relaxed in the Caribbean colonies than the Puritan ones, mostly owing to the Anglican upper class, who were less concerned with sexual immodesty than the Puritans. This relaxed attitude becomes more apparent during the governorship of Carlisle between 1678 and 1680. In a letter to officials in London, he wrote of how 5 sailors from a Royal Navy vessel were tried for sodomy. One was acquitted, but the remaining men were found guilty and sentenced to death. 3 of them were quickly pardoned by the governor, saying that white men were scarce on the island. The 4th, Francis Dilly, was executed. He would have been pardoned, but was regarded as the ringleader. I do not want to imagine what kind of ring that would have been. The maritime scene is nowadays strongly associated with homosexuality, but this does not appear to have been the case in the 17th or 18th centuries. There seems to be a considerable lack of cultural works referencing sailors as being active sodomites. The closest might come from the erotic novel Fanny Hill, published in 1748. When Fanny is about to do the deed with a sailor, he mistakenly inserts his member into the wrong entry. When Fanny warns him, he says, "My dear, any port in a storm." It has been debated between historians whether sodomy was something common or uncommon in the Navy and Merchant Marine of the 17th and 18th centuries. Peter Earle remarked in his book, Sailors, English Merchant Seamen, 1650 to 1775, how sodomy was disapproved of in England and was a capital offence, while the crowded conditions of shipboard life made it difficult to conceal homosexual relations from other members of the crew. He was only able to find 3 references to sodomy during his research. But other sources appear to disagree, especially on the point of privacy, which is somewhat surprising. In 1649, 16-year-old John Durant was indicted for having been buggered by the Indian Abdul Rahim. Numerous witnesses testified that the two had frequently been involved in buggery and mutual masturbation below deck, and even upon the quarterdeck, which was one of the most frequented work areas of the ship. The fact that these 2 men were able to engage in such explicit acts in what was presumably in front of everyone is quite baffling. Some have explained that privacy was not deemed a necessary part of sex in the period. People lived in small households, often sharing a bed and almost always the same room. If a couple wanted to have sex, they would just do it, same as the farm animals people grew up exposed to. Of course, it could have been that John and Abdul only did it during night shifts, for example, when the deck would have been less populated and only seen by a few. The incident is incredibly strange for someone in the 21st century, and really shows just how little we know about this period. In the end, Abdul and John were whipped 40 times and had salt rubbed in their wounds, still more lenient than being executed. The court was primarily disgusted by John having allowed himself to be penetrated by a heathen. Nowadays it's just the average Londoner. Other sodomites were more cautious about maintaining privacy, whether out of a wish to avoid punishment or from personal preferences. Captain Samuel Norman had the courtesy to close the door when he bugged his servant boy. He first lured the 14-year-old into his cabin, saying he needed a leg massage after horseback riding ashore. The boy was well aware of Norman's intentions, and suggested another, more receptive lad aboard the ship as a superior partner, but Norman was not dissuaded. When seduction failed, he simply bent the boy over and quickly did his deed. This happened 2 more times before the lad went to his father, who raised complaints. Norman was never brought to trial, the reasons why being unknown. Indeed, owing to the popular preference for young boys in this period, they were usually the ones falling victim to sodomy. Whether it was a captain raping his cabin boy or 2 sailors engaging in consensual sodomy, it doesn't seem to have been enough to indict them unless if there were political interests, or if the sodomy became disruptive or excessive. Robert Hewitt was brought to trial in the early 1630s for buggering 3 different men and a boy, all during a single voyage. That has got to be a world record or something. Later in the decade, sailor Robert Stone was indicted for violating a cabin boy and consistently trying to seduce his crewmates, even if they were married. So again, the situation in the 17th century appears to have been similar to the one on land. Sodomy wasn't especially common, people didn't really care if you kept it at least somewhat modestly, and it was seldom enough to get you executed. The increasingly hostile attitude towards homosexuals developing in the 18th century seems to have carried over into the maritime scene. Between 1690 and 1840, the Royal Navy prosecuted at least 345 men and boys for homoerotic crimes in naval courts martial. At least 79 were sentenced to death, and at least 36 were actually executed. In 1761, the Navy hanged a boy of only 14 years of age. Floggings were more common, but such lighter punishments could invoke conflict. In one mid-18th century instance, a captain complained when 2 of his sodomite marines received corporal and not capital punishment, and the men were eventually discharged. When taking a deeper look into the testimonies, it appears as if sailors often reacted to homosexuality with nonchalance or indifference. In a testimony given in 1808, a marine admitted to seeing the defendants kiss and display intimacy. He never formed any evil opinion upon it, until someone else declared it inappropriate. Several instances report sailors simply laughing when they witnessed sodomy and even bestiality. So the attitudes appear to have been more complicated than uniformal loathing. Other testimonies reveal that known sodomites and even men involved in known relationships were tolerated. In a trial from 1705, 2 sailors on the ship Expedition admitted to a sexual relationship that went back at least to a previous commission. It has been alleged that the seafaring lifestyle was especially appealing to homosexuals, since you'd be spending time away at sea in the exclusive company of men. But there isn't any strong evidence to prove that homosexuality was especially widespread in the maritime scene of the 17th and 18th centuries. At the same time, it wasn't unheard of, and attitudes towards it was quite diverse and evolved over time. In the 17th century, people were mostly ambivalent, whereas in the 18th century there was a mix of ambivalence, nonchalance and hostility. In most instances, punishment was light. At the very rump end of the video, we arrive at a discussion of pirates and sodomy, and whether we can truly answer the question of the video title. As has been proven, during a majority of the pirate age, land and maritime society was largely ambivalent towards sodomy. It was regarded as one of many sexual sins, but if you kept it mostly to yourself, it was unlikely to get you punished. B.R. Burg proposed in his somewhat infamous book that owing to this relative acceptance of homosexuals in wider society, the male-dominated pirate society in the Caribbean would have been almost entirely homosexual. But that's just a theory, a gay theory. Burg admits himself that it's largely a theory with little to no historical evidence to prove it. Of course, pirate society in general is poorly documented, and a lot of these more private parts of 17th century life were never documented, as it wasn't always deemed interesting or simply taken for granted. Some of Burg's arguments make a lot of sense, and others don't. He claims that since piracy was overwhelmingly male-dominated and hypermasculine, it would have been very appealing to homosexuals. This is true, as evidenced by pirate writers. They looked down upon effeminacy, and as was previously proven, homosexuality was not associated with effeminacy until the turn of the 18th century and the Mollies. It is also true that pirates were extreme sexual degenerates and sinners in general, engaging in gluttony, blaspheming, excessive drinking and sexual orgies. From the religious standpoint, which everyone in the period lived by, it would have been hypocritical of them to regard sodomy as any worse than any of their crimes. And keep in mind that rape was socially regarded as worse than sodomy, and the pirates' stance on rape is quite well known. It is very likely that pirate society contained a higher amount of homosexuals than other parts of the world. But one of Burg's pitfalls is that he sees pirate society as permanent, and that most pirates were driven to it almost entirely out of sexual interest. It was only a selected group of very reckless pirates, most often those alive at the very rump end in the 1720s, who regarded their profession as permanent, or, well, basically a short ride straight into hell. Most of them saw it as a temporary stage in a longer career at sea. They wanted to make a quick score, earn a bunch of cash, and then retire. Piracy was not any different from any other colonial get-rich-quick scheme. Of course, it did not always work as well as they hoped, but most pirates from the buccaneers to the Red Seamen appear to have had the goal to make a quick big buck, use it to buy land, get a wife, and settle down. Of course, there were piratical societies which were semi-settled, and only engaged in piracy on occasion, when recruited into a passing company, or even constructing their own canoes and piraguas. These were the logwood cutters in Campeche, the cattle hunters of Tortuga, and the Madagascar pirates who lived as tribal princes and mercenaries to the local Malagasy. These men often had close male bonds, were isolated in the wilderness, and lived rough. It seems like a 17th century Brokeback Mountain, but maybe not. These men had ready access to women and were often described as exploiting it. The logwood cutters would frequently kidnap local natives, making the women their slaves and concubines. The hunters would spend months in the wilderness, only to return to society in one of the colonies and engage with prostitutes. It is a myth that these early buccaneers were single male only. The first wave of them who arrived on Tortuga in 1629 brought with them wives and children, who were then slain in the Spanish assault. But it is true that women in the French and English colonies were a scarcity, especially in the first half of the 17th century. But these hunters and all pirates could also engage with Spanish women. The Spanish colonies had an even ratio of male to female. A lot of Spanish women, slaves especially, were raped in pirate attacks. Others were prostitutes, and some were regular women who just met a nice pirate and engaged in casual sex with him. The buccaneer Bartholomew Sharp bragged about one such incident in his journal. She was afraid of him at first, before he proved to be generous and friendly, at least according to him. And finally there's the Madagascar pirates. Pretty much all descriptions we have of pirates, sailors, and really anyone settling on Madagascar involves them building up a harem of local concubines. One of Burg's arguments is that pirates would have resorted to homosexuality in lack of women, a lack which really did not exist, or it wasn't long enough to become a problem for the majority. I cannot go through all of Burg's arguments, because the video is already long enough. All of it can basically be amounted down to theories which are interesting but have little to no supporting evidence. He has a tendency of reading a bit too much into it, and sees potential homosexual incidents where there is no indication of them being there. I personally find it strange that, if pirates were such frequent sodomites, why is there not a single instance of their enemies using it against them, when accusations of sodomy were an incredibly common political and humoristic tool? Especially when their critics had no trouble pointing out their drinking habits, cursing, blaspheming, torture, rape, etc. If 17th century society was so open about discussing sodomy, then why stop here? I have only encountered 2 incidents explicitly involving sodomites and pirates. In the most well-known incident, during the Pacific Adventure, the aforementioned Bartholomew Sharp was deposed from his captaincy. An old buccaneer and presumed Puritan named John Watling replaced him. Watling's first act was to imprison one of Sharp's close associates, Edmund Cook, after Edmund's servant claimed that Edmund had sodomized him at several points. Obviously, this was a political move by Watling to discredit a rival in a power struggle. Sharp was shortly afterwards released from prison, along with Edmund, and he would later restore his captaincy. All of this indicates that Edmund was falsely accused, or that he was a sodomite indeed, but the buccaneers did not care enough about it, until the more stricter Puritan came in power and decided to use it as a case for imprisoning a political rival. It is not different at all from the power struggles in the maritime scene and even high society. Lastly is an incident involving one of my favorite historical figures, the extremely morally bankrupt governor of the Bahamas, Cadwallader Jones. Jones invited pirates to New Providence, where he gave them commissions and used them to crack down on local freedoms and democracy. He would even recruit criminals from the local prison to support him. In one instance, Jones's chief opponent, Thomas Bulkley, was brought to trial under which the jury consisted of 6 pirates, 3 transient strangers, 2 drunken sots, and finally, a person arranged for buggery. In this incident, we discover that a sodomite was able to find refuge in a corrupt, piratically dominated society. In a world where everyone was turned against them, it was unlikely that sinful pirates were picky about their allies, and those who fled from a judgmental society for their preferences might have felt the same. Then there's the issue of pederasty. Like homosexuality, it is not something well documented among pirates. Instead, we have mentions of individual pirates keeping young boys as servants or slaves. There is the very glaring incident of Pirate Captain Charles Swan kidnapping a young Mexican boy from his mother to keep as a slave. That he wanted an extra mouth to feed, to simply serve him food or light his pipe, might appear far-fetched. The boy was also documented as being well treated by Swan, who was very fond of him. Maybe there is some vital 17th century context I'm missing, or maybe the captain truly was looking to satisfy his needs. Compared to the Navy or Merchant Marine, cabin boys were not as frequently seen in pirate companies, partly because it was more difficult for them to find a pirate crew, and partly because parents would not send their children to them. There are very few cases of young boys joining pirate crews willingly and explicitly. Most often they were servants or slaves owned by specific crewmen. Some companies even had articles limiting the recruitment of boys. Bartholomew Roberts said the following: "No boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were found seducing any of the ladder's sex, and carried her to sea, disguised, he was to suffer death." This has been interpreted as pirates viewing boys as sexual objects similar to women. It is just as likely that it meant a wish to preserve the masculinity of the company, and that resources were scarce and could only be given to those who worked for their upkeep. Likewise, it is interesting that the second phrase draws a sexual connotation to women. They are something to be seduced, but no obvious sexual connotations are ever drawn to boys. Of course, there wouldn't need to be, or rather would be impossible to disguise. No other article mentions boys in any similar context, and no depositions from pirate boys remark about them being sodomized, even if they were otherwise treated poorly. The following was said of John Sparks, a boy aboard Every's Fancy. This examinate was kept on board of the company, but as a kind of slave to wash their clothes, sweep the decks and light their pipes. Of course, maybe Sparks chose not to mention incidents of buggery, but one can speculate upon anything. It must also be mentioned that a young boy going aboard any ship was not a guarantee of them being sodomized. The amount of willing sodomites aboard any ship no doubt fluctuated. There is a popular idea floating around that pirates engaged in gay marriage, the so-called matelotage. Firstly, matelotage was not exclusive to pirates or buccaneers. Known sometimes in English as consortship, with the partners called mates, consorts or comrades. The pairing of two men in a dangerous work was as common at sea as it was on land. One manual compared to the comrade soldiers who march in the same rank. And pairing for security is still common in the military and law enforcement. The partner acted as an heir and executor. They would share possessions and never lie to each other. Sailors were likewise expected to hot bunk, the act of sharing a bed. This did not mean they slept together. Sailors shifted between working and relaxing in 4-hour shifts, meaning that the berth would only be occupied by one matelo at a time. The consortship was seldom recorded, simply agreed upon between two men, often with 1 or 2 witnesses. We have one matelotage agreement preserved, signed in 1699 between the two pirates Francis Reed and John Beavis at Fort Dauphin. The document was signed and sealed by 2 witnesses, Robert Arnott and Francis Billing. It is incredibly short, basically just saying they are now in a consortship, and if one dies, the other is to have his treasure. Regarding the relationship between the 2 matelots, a French book from 1671 described it as follows. The two companions call each other my matelot, love each other and assist each other, and in the ship they do the same assignments at the same time, helping each other in everything, like brothers. Whilst it is said that matelots love each other, their relationship is likewise compared to brotherhood, showing that it was primarily regarded as a platonic work relationship. Keep in mind that men were allowed to be closer in the 17th century, and the matelotage allowed two men to enter into a more meaningful, emotional bond. The consortship did not prevent the consorts from having relations with women or even being married. Some of them even shared their women like a possession. The colonial female population was still quite low. Alexander Exquemelin documented how if two of them found a woman they both desired, they would throw the dice to see who would get her. The winner would marry her, but the loser would still be received at their house. Of course, this bond could definitely have been signed and sealed owing to a homosexual relationship between two men, and it would functionally allow them to operate as married partners. I have encountered one instance of a matelotage which seems to have had homosexual undertones. In 1665, the governor of Tortuga wrote how Captain Legolif decided to marry one of the women recently imported. Pulverie, the captain's matelot, was distraught. He sought solace in drink, before eventually demanding access to the marriage chamber. But despite having access to all of his consort's goods, he would not gain access to the woman. Pulverie would soon have his revenge, when Madame Legolif was found cheating on her husband. Pulverie killed both the woman and her lover, before escaping. Capitan Legolif found a new matelot, but would never be as fond of him as of Pulverie. Legolif was known as Bourgnefes, one-eyedness, suspicious, referred to his enemies as bougres, and complained that the loss of a buttock to a cannonball made him an especially desirable partner to all manners of fellows. So, were pirates gay? There isn't any explicit evidence to prove that homosexuality was more widespread among pirates than anywhere else. However, 17th century society was surprisingly tolerant towards homosexuals, even if it was regarded as taboo. The pirate lifestyle, male-dominated, isolated from judgmental society and more accepting towards sinners and criminals of all sorts, would no doubt have been a popular refuge for homosexuals. So in the end, I think it would have been likelier to find homosexuals within pirate companies, perhaps something like a 15 to 20% ratio compared to the 5 to 10 in general society. But as I mentioned a while back in the beginning of this very long episode, our modern notion of homosexuality and sexual identity did not exist in this period. Most of the men discovered as exhibiting homosexual behavior also engaged sexually with women, or even with young boys or animals. So when looking at popular media like Black Sails, which sought to explore a homosexual relationship in this period, I think it was doing it too simply. Hope you enjoyed the video. No homo. Chances are high that this video will be demonetized, owing to the topics I've discussed rather frankly. Ad revenue is the biggest reason I'm able to produce these videos, so if you want to ensure that I get paid, you can make a one-time donation via PayPal, become a channel member or Patreon supporter. You'll find all of the necessary links in the video description. If the video gets demonetized, I might edit out some of the less advertiser-friendly sections and re-upload sometime in the future. And Patreon supporters will always be able to view my videos uncensored and without ads. If you want to support me and get something nice in return, I've recently teamed up with Mythology Candles, a small Washington-based company who produce, well, candles, themed around fantasy and historical topics. They've recently added a pirate-themed Black Flag selection, including such delectable items as Forbidden Jungle, with hints of damp earth, fresh palm leaves, and cooling aloe. And perfect for a little romantic evening, whatever your inclinations are, as long as they do not involve the pig people. You'll find my affiliate link on screen, in the video description, or pinned comment below. I also do live streams a couple times a month. Next one will be on the 29th of June, at 11 AM East Coast, which is 16 PM UTC. I'll also be including a surprise guest. We're both looking forward to meeting you. See you there.